The festival lights blurred into halos of color as Marcus stood frozen in the sudden quiet, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. Around him, families who moments before had been laughing and enjoying funnel cakes now clutched their children closer, whispering urgent words he couldn't quite catch. The scent of kettle corn and wood smoke still hung heavy, but the warmth had drained from the evening like blood from a wound. Emma appeared at his elbow, her small hand finding his. "Daddy?" Her voice was barely audible above the wind. "What happened?" Everyone looked scared. Marcus looked down at his daughter's upturned face. So much like Sarah's, it sometimes stopped his heart, and felt the familiar weight of protecting her settle back onto his shoulders. The strange clarity that had possessed him moments ago was already fading, leaving behind only fragments. He remembered the rage building as those boys mocked Emma's stutter, the way they'd imitated her halting words while she tried to order hot chocolate with the 5 crumpled dollars he'd given her. But the rest felt like trying to recall a dream. "I don't know, sweetheart." The honesty in his admission surprised him. "Let's get you warmed up." The hot chocolate vendor, a weathered woman named Mrs. Patterson who ran the town's only bakery, handed Emma a steaming cup with shaking fingers. She wouldn't meet Marcus's eyes, though he'd been fixing her delivery van for 2 years and she'd always been friendly before. Tonight, she looked at him the way people looked at wolves that had wandered too close to civilization. "On the house," she mumbled, then quickly turned away to help another customer. So, Marcus guided Emma toward a bench near the bandstand where a local bluegrass group had been performing. The musicians were packing up their instruments now, though their set wasn't supposed to end for another hour. The festival that typically ran until 10 o'clock was bleeding attendees like a punctured tire. Emma sipped her hot chocolate, steam fogging her glasses. Those boys were being mean. "I know." Marcus watched the crowd thin as families made excuses and headed for their cars. "But they won't bother you anymore. How do you know?" It was a simple question that cut to the bone of something he couldn't explain. How did he know? How had he known anything about those boys or their families? In 3 years of living in Cedar Falls, he'd kept his head down, spoken only when necessary, and made sure never to get too close to anyone. That was how you stayed invisible when powerful people wanted you dead. Yet somehow, he'd stood there and recited intimate details about the Morrison family's financial troubles, about Janet Caldwell's affair with her husband's business partner, about old Henry Voss's actions during the My Lai massacre. Facts that should have been impossible for him to know, delivered with a certainty that had terrified him as much as anyone else. "I just do," he told Emma, because admitting his confusion would only frighten her more. A police cruiser pulled into the festival grounds, its headlights cutting through the early darkness. Marcus tensed automatically. 3 years of running had made him allergic to authority figures of any kind. But Sheriff Rebecca Martinez stepped out, and her expression held more concern than suspicion as she approached. "Marcus, everything all right here?" Sheriff Martinez was one of the few people in town who treated him like a human being rather than a curiosity. She'd never asked probing questions about his past, or why a man with his obvious military training had chosen to fix motorcycles in the middle of nowhere. In return, he'd helped her department a few times when they'd needed someone who understood tactical situations. "Just enjoying the festival," Marcus said carefully. Martinez glanced around at the rapidly emptying grounds. "Funny way of showing it. Got a few calls about some kind of disturbance. Something about you knowing things you shouldn't know." Emma pressed closer to his side, and Marcus felt that familiar surge of protective fury. But this time, no mysterious knowledge accompanied it. Just the steady, reliable anger of a father who'd lost too much already. "Boys were picking on Emma. I had a word with them." Must have been quite a word. Martinez studied his face with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 20 years reading people. "Marcus, I've always appreciated that you keep to yourself and don't cause trouble, but if there's something I should know, something that might affect the safety of this community, I need you to tell me." The wind picked up, sending empty paper cups skittering across the frozen ground. In the distance, Marcus could hear car engines starting, parents herding their families away from whatever they thought he represented. Emma shivered despite her hot chocolate, and he made his decision. "There's nothing to tell, Sheriff. Just a misunderstanding." Martinez nodded slowly, but her hand rested on her radio. All right. But Marcus? Maybe it's time you and Emma headed home too. It wasn't a suggestion. Marcus nodded to Sheriff Martinez, keeping his expression neutral despite the warning in her tone. Come on, Em. Let's head home. The walk to their pickup truck felt like crossing a minefield. Every whispered conversation seemed to pause as they passed. Every sideways glance felt loaded with suspicion. Emma stayed pressed against his side, her free hand clutching the hot chocolate Mrs. Patterson had given her. The threadbare coat that had started this whole mess hung loose on her small frame, a constant reminder of everything he couldn't provide. Their truck, a 15-year-old Ford with rust eating through the wheel wells, sat in the gravel lot behind the Methodist church. Marcus had parked there deliberately, away from the main crowd, close to 3 different exit routes. Old habits died hard, even in a town where the biggest crime was usually teenagers spray painting the water tower. Emma climbed into the passenger seat and immediately turned the heater to full blast. The engine coughed to life on the second try, a sound that made Marcus wince. The transmission was going, had been for months, but replacing it would cost more than he'd saved in the past year. In the Special Forces, he'd commanded missions worth millions of dollars. Now he counted quarters for Emma's school lunch money. Daddy? Emma's voice was soft, tentative. Are we in trouble? No, sweetheart. Everything's fine. The lie came easily, worn smooth by 3 years of practice. Nothing was fine. Nothing had been fine since that night in Kabul when Sarah's car exploded in a fireball of twisted metal and government secrets. They drove through Cedar Falls's modest downtown, a single strip of brick buildings housing a grocery store, a hardware shop, Martinez's bakery, and Rusty's bar. Most of the storefronts showed dark windows this time of night, but Rusty's glowed with warm light and the promise of escape that Marcus never allowed himself. 3 beers, and he might start talking. Start remembering things better left buried. Their trailer sat on the outskirts of town, part of a small park that had seen better decades. Marcus paid cash rent to a landlord who'd never asked for references and didn't mind that his tenant worked on motorcycles in the gravel driveway. It wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen barely big enough for 1 person, a living room dominated by Emma's homework table, but it was theirs. Inside, Emma went straight to her room to change into pajamas while Marcus checked the locks. Front door, back door, both windows. He tested the motion sensor he'd installed in the narrow hallway, not connected to any alarm system, just a small device that would light up if anyone moved through their home while they slept. Paranoid maybe, but paranoia had kept them alive for 3 years. Emma emerged wearing flannel pajamas covered in horses, her dark hair freed from its ponytail. So much like Sarah, it sometimes stole his breath. The same serious brown eyes, the same way of tilting her head when she was thinking. Sarah had been brilliant, a CIA analyst who'd stumbled onto something that got her killed. Emma had inherited that intelligence, along with the stutter that had started the night they'd run from their old life. Can we read tonight? Emma asked, settling onto the worn couch with a book clutched to her chest. It was their routine, 30 minutes of reading together before bed, no matter how tired Marcus was from crawling under engines all day. Of course. Marcus sat beside her, automatically angling himself so he could see both the front door and the window. What are we reading? Harry Potter. Emma opened to a bookmarked page, the part where he finds out he's famous, but he doesn't understand why. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. He'd once been famous too, in certain circles. Colonel Marcus Holloway, the man who'd exposed a weapons trafficking ring that reached into the highest levels of the Pentagon, the man who'd been branded a traitor for refusing to let it be buried. Now he was nobody, just Tank, the quiet mechanic who could fix any bike but rarely fixed anything else. Emma began to read aloud, her stutter making her careful with each word. H. Harry looked at the Daily Prophet again. They don't know we're not allowed to use magic at home. I'm going to have a lot of fun with Dudley this summer. Marcus listened to his daughter's halting progress through Rowling's words and felt the familiar ache of everything he couldn't give her. Speech therapy they couldn't afford, new clothes instead of thrift store finds, a father who wasn't looking over his shoulder every time someone knocked on the door. Most of all, He couldn't give her the truth about why they lived this way, about why her mother had died, about the enemies who would kill them both if they ever found this trailer on the edge of nowhere. But tonight, something had changed. Tonight, he'd known things that should have been impossible to know, and as Emma's voice filled their small living room with stories of magic and hidden worlds, Marcus wondered if their carefully constructed ordinary life was about to shatter all over again. The knock came at 2:47 a.m., sharp and deliberate against the trailer's thin door. Marcus was awake before the third rap, his hand already reaching for the .45 he kept in the nightstand drawer. 3 years of hypervigilance had trained his body to distinguish between the random sounds of a settling trailer and something that mattered. This mattered. He slipped from bed, bare feet silent on the cold linoleum, and moved to Emma's room. She was still asleep, her breathing steady and peaceful. Whatever was about to happen, he wanted her to stay that way as long as possible. The knocking came again, more insistent now. Marcus made his way to the living room window and carefully pulled back a corner of the curtain. A black sedan sat in his driveway, its engine still ticking as it cooled. Government plates. His blood turned to ice water. They'd found him. But then he saw who stood on his doorstep, and confusion replaced terror. Sheriff Martinez waited in the yellow glow of his porch light, but she wasn't alone. Beside her stood an elderly man Marcus didn't recognize. Tall, silver-haired, wearing an expensive coat that looked out of place in Cedar Falls. Behind them, barely visible in the sedan's passenger seat, was another figure. Marcus checked the magazine in his pistol and tucked it into the waistband of his jeans. Whatever this was, it wasn't a standard arrest. Martinez would have brought backup, would have surrounded the trailer. This felt like something else entirely. He opened the door, but left the chain engaged, creating a gap just wide enough to see out. "It's almost 3 in the morning, Sheriff." "I know what time it is." Martinez's voice was tight, stressed. "Marcus, this is Dr. Edmund Blackwood from the University of Montana. He needs to speak with you about what happened tonight." Nothing happened tonight. Dr. Blackwood stepped forward slightly, and Marcus got his first good look at the man. 70s, maybe older, but with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. "Mr. Holloway, I believe you told young Tyler Morrison that his father has been stealing from the hardware store's register to pay for his gambling debts. You mentioned that Janet Caldwell has been meeting Robert Hayes at the Sleepy Inn Motel every Tuesday for the past 8 months. And you somehow knew that Henry Voss never spoke about his time in Vietnam because of something that happened in a village near Da Nang." Marcus's grip tightened on the door. "I don't know what you're talking about." "All of those things are true." Blackwood's voice was calm, academic. "I've spent the last 4 hours making phone calls, checking records. Tyler Morrison's father has embezzled nearly $12,000. Mrs. Caldwell's affair is an open secret among certain circles, and Henry Voss was indeed present during events in Vietnam that the military preferred to keep classified." So you've been in Cedar Falls for 3 years. You keep to yourself, work on motorcycles, and according to Sheriff Martinez, you've never shown any interest in local gossip or politics. Yet somehow, you knew intimate details about families you've barely spoken to. Through the gap in the door, Marcus could see Martinez shifting uncomfortably. "Marcus, I've got 12 families calling me tonight, all scared out of their minds. They're saying you knew things about them that nobody should know, things that happened before you came to town, things they never told anyone. People talk. Small towns are full of secrets. Not these secrets." Blackwood reached into his coat and Marcus tensed, but the man only withdrew a manila folder. "Mr. Holloway, how much do you know about the town of Cedar Falls? Its history, I mean, its founding. It's just another Montana mining town that went bust. Actually, it's quite unique. Cedar Falls was founded in 1887 by a consortium of investors from back east. Mining was never the primary industry here, despite what the local histories claim. The town was built around a very different kind of operation, one that your government has been trying to locate for decades." Marcus felt the world tilting beneath him. "My government? You were special forces, weren't you? Army intelligence? I imagine you've heard whispers about programs that officially don't exist. Research into human consciousness, enhanced interrogation techniques, experiments in remote viewing and psychic phenomena. The 45 felt heavy against Marcus's back. This was wrong, all wrong. His cover identity was solid. Tank Morrison, former Army mechanic with an honorable discharge and clean background. Nobody should know about Colonel Marcus Holloway. I think you have me confused with someone else. Blackwood smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. 3 hours ago, you demonstrated abilities that suggest otherwise. The question is whether you're developing these capabilities naturally, or whether Cedar Falls itself is somehow enhancing them. Emma's voice drifted from her bedroom, sleepy and confused. Daddy? Who's at the door? Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of an impossible choice. He could slam the door, pack Emma in the truck, and run again. Start over in another town with another name, or he could face whatever truth these people were offering and risk everything he'd built to protect his daughter. Give me 5 minutes to get dressed, he said finally, and slipped the chain free. Blackwood stepped into the narrow trailer with the measured confidence of a man accustomed to being welcomed into strangers' homes at ungodly hours. Sheriff Martinez followed, her hand resting unconsciously on her service weapon, a gesture that didn't escape Marcus's notice. The trailer's cramped living room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in like a closing fist. Daddy? Emma appeared in her bedroom doorway, rubbing her eyes. The stuffed rabbit she'd had since before Sarah's death hung from one small fist. It's okay, sweetheart. Just some people who need to talk to me. Marcus moved protectively between his daughter and the visitors. Go back to bed. I'll be right here. Emma's dark eyes, so like Sarah's it was painful, swept over the strangers with the wariness of a child who'd learned too young that the world held monsters. Are we leaving again? The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. 3 years old, when they'd fled their old life, Emma's memories of that night were fragmented, dreamlike. But she remembered enough. The hasty packing, the pre-dawn drive, the string of motels and safe houses that had eventually led them here. She remembered running. No, baby, we're not leaving. Go back to sleep. Emma hesitated, then nodded and disappeared into her room. Marcus waited until he heard her bed creak before turning back to his uninvited guests. Blackwood was studying the sparse living room, the second-hand furniture, Emma's homework spread across the kitchen table, the careful poverty of a man trying to stay invisible. You've done well, Blackwood said quietly. 3 years without a single flag raised, new social security number, driver's license, employment history, very professional work. Marcus's jaw tightened. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course not. Blackwood settled onto the worn couch as if he'd been invited, opening his manila folder. Tank Morrison, former Army mechanic, honorably discharged in 2018. Moved to Cedar Falls in January 2021 with his daughter after his wife died in a car accident. Opened a small motorcycle repair business, pays his taxes, keeps to himself. Sheriff Martinez remained standing near the door, her expression troubled. Marcus, I've been covering for you for 3 years. Never asked why a man with your obvious training ended up fixing bikes in the middle of nowhere. Never questioned why you pay everything in cash or why you flinch every time a federal vehicle drives through town. Rebecca, but tonight changed things. Her voice carried the weight of difficult decisions. I've got families threatening to leave town because they think you can read their minds. The mayor's breathing down my neck, and I've got 3 county commissioners demanding answers I don't have. Marcus moved to the kitchen window, checking the darkness beyond. Old habits. Always know your exits, always watch for threats. So you brought a stranger to my home in the middle of the night? Dr. Blackwood isn't a stranger, Martinez said. He's been researching Cedar Falls for 15 years. Blackwood looked up from his folder. Your daughter has nightmares, doesn't she? About fire and loud noises. She developed her stutter after a traumatic event, something she witnessed but can't fully process. Marcus spun around, his hand instinctively moving toward the pistol at his back. Don't you dare! I'm not threatening her. Blackwood's voice remained maddeningly calm. I'm pointing out that you both carry the psychological markers of people who've experienced extreme trauma, the kind that comes from losing everything in a single night. The trailer's heater cycled on, filling the silence with mechanical noise. Marcus stared at this stranger who somehow knew his daughter's pain, who'd waltzed into their carefully constructed anonymity and threatened to tear it apart. Every instinct screamed at him to grab Emma and run. The truck had half a tank of gas. They could be in Canada by morning. But he'd run before, and running had brought them here, to this moment, in this trailer, with his daughter asking if they were leaving again. The truth was, he was tired. Bone-deep, soul-crushing tired of looking over his shoulder, of jumping at shadows, of lying to the one person in the world who mattered most to him. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "Answers," Blackwood said. "The same thing you want. What happened to you tonight shouldn't be possible, yet 12 witnesses saw it. You accessed information that exists nowhere in public records, spoke truths that these families thought were buried forever. Maybe I just pay attention." "To what?" "Henry Voss's military records are classified beyond your security clearance. Janet Caldwell's affair was conducted with the discretion of two people with everything to lose. The Morrison family's financial troubles are known only to their accountant and the bank manager, both of whom signed confidentiality agreements." Marcus closed his eyes, remembering the strange certainty that had filled him at the festival. The absolute knowledge of things he'd never learned, spoken in a voice that hadn't quite felt like his own. "I don't know how I knew those things." "That's why I'm here," Blackwood said softly. "Because Cedar Falls has a history of doing impossible things to people. And because the organization that destroyed your family has been looking for this place for a very long time." Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside him, like tectonic plates grinding against each other deep beneath the earth. The walls of the trailer seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, and for a moment he could swear he felt the presence of every sleeping soul in Cedar Falls, their dreams, their fears, their buried secrets calling to him like distant radio signals. "What organization?" His voice sounded hollow, foreign to his own ears. Blackwood leaned forward, his academic composure cracking slightly. "The same shadow network that had your wife killed. The one that branded you a traitor for exposing their weapons trafficking operation. They call themselves the Meridian Collective, and they've been hunting something in this region for decades. Sarah was CIA. She died because she found evidence of... She died because she discovered Cedar Falls." Blackwood's words hit like physical blows. Her investigation into illegal arms sales led her here, to this town. The collective has been searching for this place since the 1950s, following rumors of a government facility that went dark during the Cold War. Sheriff Martinez shifted uncomfortably. "Marcus, there are things about this town. Things the old-timers whisper about but never say outright. Buildings that used to exist but aren't on any maps. People who lived here once but have no records, no graves." Marcus moved to Emma's doorway, checking on her sleeping form. She lay curled around her stuffed rabbit, peaceful and unaware that her world was disintegrating again. He'd promised himself this would never happen. No more running, no more secrets, no more late-night visitors bringing nightmares to their door. But here they were. "You're saying my wife found this place and they killed her to keep it secret?" "I'm saying she found references to Project Looking Glass," Blackwood said, pulling photographs from his folder. "A psychological research facility that operated here from 1952 to 1974. Officially, it never existed. Unofficially, it was developing techniques for enhanced human perception, remote viewing, telepathic communication, consciousness expansion." The photographs showed a compound that Marcus didn't recognize, though something about the landscape looked familiar. Concrete buildings surrounded by chain-link fencing, military vehicles, men in white coats standing beside subjects with electrodes attached to their heads. The facility was shut down after an incident that killed 17 researchers and an unknown number of test subjects. The buildings were demolished, the records classified, and the entire program was supposedly terminated. Blackwood's finger traced the edge of one photograph, but the effects lingered. People who moved to Cedar Falls afterward began reporting strange experiences. Knowing things they shouldn't know, seeing events from the past, accessing memories that weren't their own. Marcus thought of the festival, of the certainty that had filled him when he'd confronted Emma's tormentors. The words had come from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, carrying knowledge that felt borrowed, inherited. You think I'm connected to this somehow? I think you're the strongest manifestation we've seen in decades. Blackwood stood, moving to the window. The question is whether it's because of who you are, or because the collective's search for this place has somehow awakened something. Sheriff Martinez cleared her throat. There's something else. 3 hours ago, my deputy got a call about suspicious vehicles on the highway. Black SUVs with government plates, asking questions at the truck stop about a man and his daughter. The bottom dropped out of Marcus's world. After 3 years of peace, of anonymity, they'd been found. Emma would wake up tomorrow to discover that the life they'd built was nothing but borrowed time, and her father was about to drag her into danger again. Or she wouldn't wake up at all. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible decision. He could grab Emma right now, disappear into the Montana wilderness, try to outrun killers who had unlimited resources and no conscience. They might survive a day, maybe a week before the collective's hunters caught up with them. Or he could step into the unknown. What are you proposing? He asked. Blackwood turned from the window, his expression grave. The facility may be gone, but something remains here. Something that's been affecting residents for 50 years, and that just gave you access to information you should never have possessed. If we can understand how it works, we can what? Fight them off? Expose them? We can find out why they want this place badly enough to kill for it. And maybe, just maybe, we can turn their own weapon against them. Marcus looked one last time at his sleeping daughter, then at the photographs of a secret facility that had supposedly never existed. 3 years ago, he'd thought the truth about government corruption would set him free. Instead, it had cost him everything. But Emma deserved better than a lifetime of running. Where do we start? He said, and felt the last of his ordinary life slip away like smoke. The words hung in the air between them, final as a death sentence. Marcus had spent 3 years believing he could build a normal life through sheer force of will, but normal was a luxury men like him weren't allowed to keep. There's a place, Blackwood said, returning the photographs to his folder, about 12 miles north of town, where the old access road used to lead to the facility. The locals avoid it, claim the area feels wrong, makes them sick. But if we're going to understand what's happening to you, that's where we need to start. Sheriff Martinez checked her watch. Sun's up in 4 hours. If those federal vehicles are still in the area, they'll start a proper sweep come daylight. Then we go now. Marcus turned toward Emma's room, then stopped. He couldn't drag her into this, but he couldn't leave her alone either. The collective's reach was long, their methods without conscience. They'd already killed Sarah to keep their secrets. They wouldn't hesitate to use a 12-year-old girl as leverage. She comes with us, he said, finally. Marcus, Sheriff Martinez started. No. His voice carried the command authority of his former rank. I'm not leaving her here unprotected, and I'm not splitting up. We stay together, or we don't do this at all. Blackwood nodded slowly. Perhaps that's for the best. The phenomena here seem to have some hereditary component. If your daughter has inherited any sensitivity to whatever remains of the project, keeping her close may be safer than leaving her exposed. The casual mention of Emma's potential involvement made Marcus's protective instincts flare. She's 12 years old. She's been through enough. I understand, but consider this. Tonight, you accessed information that belonged to other people's minds, their memories, their secrets, their buried guilt. If that ability is growing stronger, if it's connected to this place, then Emma may be experiencing something similar. Children are often more sensitive to these phenomena than adults. Marcus thought of Emma's nightmares, her tendency to know things she shouldn't, like which days would be bad for him before he'd even recognized the signs himself. He'd attributed it to a traumatized child's hypervigilance, her learned ability to read the subtle tells of stress and danger. But what if it was something more? We'll need supplies, he said, accepting the inevitable. And backup plans in case this goes sideways. Sheriff Martinez unclipped her radio. I can clear the area, make sure we're not interrupted. But Marcus, if those federal agents are already here, they won't make a move until they're certain of our location. The collective prefers clean operations, minimal witnesses, maximum deniability. They'll wait for the right moment. How can you be sure? Because I used to be one of them. The admission hung heavy in the trailer's cramped space. Marcus had never spoken those words aloud, not even to Emma. For 3 years he'd buried Colonel Marcus Holloway so deep that sometimes he almost believed Tank Morrison was real. Blackwood's eyes sharpened with academic interest. Special access programs? Need to know, and you don't. Marcus moved toward Emma's room. Give me 10 minutes to wake her and pack emergency supplies. Sheriff, I need you to get us transportation that can't be tracked, something off the books. My personal truck's parked around back. Nobody knows I'm here tonight. Good. Dr. Blackwood, whatever equipment you think we'll need to investigate this site, get it. But understand this, if anything happens to my daughter because of this decision, I'll hold you personally responsible. The academic's expression sobered. Mr. Holloway, I've been studying the Cedar Falls phenomenon for 15 years. I've interviewed dozens of residents, documented hundreds of incidents, tried to piece together what really happened at that facility. In all that time, I've never seen anything as powerful as what you demonstrated tonight. If we can understand it, control it, we might finally have a weapon the collective can't defend against. And if we can't, then we'll likely join the long list of people who've disappeared while investigating this place. Marcus pushed open Emma's door, watching his daughter sleep. Her face was peaceful, unmarked by the fears that haunted her waking hours. In a few minutes, he'd have to wake her and explain that their safety was an illusion, that the monsters from their old life had found them again. He'd have to ask her to be brave one more time, to trust that her father could keep her safe, even though he'd failed at that once before. The strange certainty that had filled him at the festival stirred again, bringing with it fragments of knowledge that weren't quite his own. Images of concrete corridors and observation rooms, of men in white coats taking notes while subjects screamed behind soundproof glass, and underneath it all, a presence, vast and patient and hungry, that had been waiting in the darkness for someone strong enough to hear its call. Marcus shivered and reached for his daughter's shoulder. Whatever was coming, they'd face it together. Emma. Marcus's voice was gentle but insistent as he shook his daughter's shoulder. Wake up, sweetheart. She stirred, blinking in the dim light filtering from the living room. Her dark hair was tangled from sleep, and for a moment she looked so young, so vulnerable, that Marcus nearly changed his mind about everything. Daddy? What time is it? Early. Listen to me carefully. He sat on the edge of her bed, choosing his words with the precision of a man defusing a bomb. Remember how we talked about having to leave our old house very quickly? About how sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices to keep their families safe? Emma's eyes sharpened instantly, sleep falling away like a discarded blanket. She'd inherited his survival instincts along with his dark eyes. Are we running again? The question cut deeper than any blade. 3 years of stability, of bedtime stories and homework help and birthday parties, reduced to its essential truth. They'd always been running, just standing still. Not running, but we need to go somewhere tonight, and it might be dangerous. Marcus pulled her small duffel bag from the closet, the one they'd never fully unpacked. Old habits, pack light, warm clothes, anything you can't leave behind. Emma sat up, her stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest. Are the bad people back? Marcus's hands stilled on the zipper. She'd been 5 when Sarah died, 7 when they'd fled their old life. He'd tried to shield her from the worst truths, but children had ways of understanding more than adults wanted them to know. Maybe. But we're not going to let them hurt us. He forced confidence into his voice. Sheriff Martinez is here, and Dr. Blackwood. They're going to help us figure out what happened at the festival tonight. When you scared those kids? Emma pulled a sweater from her dresser, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to pack quickly. You sounded different, like someone else was talking through you. The observation sent ice through Marcus's veins. If Emma had noticed the change, then whatever was happening to him was more obvious than he'd hoped. And if she was sensitive to it. Did you hear what I said to them? The specific words? Emma paused, a pair of jeans halfway to her bag. Not words exactly, but I could feel what you were feeling. Like when you know someone's angry before they start yelling, except stronger. And there was something else there too. Something bigger than you. Marcus knelt beside her, taking her small hands in his. They were cold, trembling slightly. Emma, I need you to tell me if you've been having any strange experiences lately. Dreams that feel too real, knowing things you shouldn't know, hearing voices that aren't there. She bit her lower lip, a gesture that reminded him painfully of Sarah. Sometimes I wake up and I know things. Like last week, I knew Mrs. Peterson was going to cry before she even looked sad. And yesterday, before the festival, I knew something bad was going to happen to us there. Why didn't you tell me? Because you would have worried. And you worry enough already. She continued packing, her movements quick and precise. Besides, I thought maybe I was just imagining it, but tonight, when those kids were being mean, I wanted them to stop hurting you, and then suddenly you had this power, and they were the ones who were scared. Marcus felt the weight of impossible responsibility settling on his shoulders. It was one thing to risk his own life chasing answers about shadow organizations and secret experiments. It was another entirely to discover that his daughter might be developing the same inexplicable abilities that had manifested in him. From the living room came the murmur of voices. Blackwood and Martinez making plans, preparing for an expedition into darkness both literal and metaphorical. In a few minutes, they'd pile into the sheriff's truck and drive toward whatever remained of a facility that had supposedly never existed. They'd walk into the unknown, armed with nothing but questions and desperate hope. Emma zipped her bag closed and looked up at him with eyes far too old for her face. Daddy, are we going to be okay? It was the same question she'd asked 3 years ago, as they'd fled through the night, leaving behind everything they'd known. He'd promised her then that everything would be all right, that they'd find somewhere safe to build a new life. It had been a lie born of love and desperation, but somehow they'd managed to make it true for a while. Now the lie was crumbling, and he didn't know what truth would replace it. I don't know, he said finally. But I promise you this, whatever happens, we face it together. No more secrets, no more half-truths. You're old enough to know what we're really up against. Emma nodded solemnly, shouldering her bag with the grim determination of a seasoned refugee. Then let's go find some answers. As they walked toward the living room together, Marcus felt the strange presence stirring again in the depths of his mind. Ancient, patient, hungry for what was to come. Sheriff Martinez's truck idled in the darkness behind the trailer, exhaust creating phantom clouds in the frigid air. Marcus helped Emma into the back seat, her small frame dwarfed by the heavy winter coat that had saved them both from humiliation just hours ago. The irony wasn't lost on him. They were heading into the unknown because of what that moment of shame had awakened in him. Dr. Blackwood sat in the passenger seat, a canvas bag of equipment at his feet. EMF detectors, digital recorders, thermal imaging devices, the tools of someone who'd spent years chasing shadows and calling it science. Marcus wondered if any of it would matter when they reached their destination. The access road's been closed for 30 years, Martinez said, as they pulled onto the empty highway. State put up barriers after too many teenagers went missing up there. Officially, it's unstable ground from old mining operations. How many missing? Marcus asked. 7 over the years. All found eventually, but... She glanced at him in the rearview mirror. They came back different. Wouldn't talk about what they'd seen, couldn't remember how they'd gotten lost. 3 of them developed severe psychiatric conditions within 6 months. Emma pressed closer to Marcus's side. Are we going to get lost too? No, sweetheart. But even as he said it, Marcus felt the wrongness Dr. Blackwood had described, a subtle dissonance that seemed to emanate from the direction they were traveling. It reminded him of the moment before enemy contact, when his body knew danger was coming before his conscious mind processed the signs. The highway curved north, following the valley between 2 mountain ridges. Marcus had driven this route dozens of times over the past 3 years, but tonight the familiar landscape felt alien. Shadows fell wrong between the trees. The starlight seemed dimmer, as if something was drinking the illumination from the sky. There, Blackwood pointed to a gap in the tree line, where rusted metal barriers blocked what had once been a paved road. "Martinez, can you get us past those?" "County equipment?" She produced a keyring from her jacket. Advantages of small-town law enforcement. As they worked to move the barriers, Marcus caught Emma staring at the darkness beyond with an expression of deep unease. "What is it?" "It's like the feeling I get from your nightmares," she whispered. "Except it's not coming from you. It's coming from out there." The observation sent adrenaline flooding through Marcus's system. If Emma was picking up psychic residue from this place, if she was already being affected— "Sheriff," he called. "How far to the site?" 3 miles up this road." Martinez swung the barrier aside, metal screeching against asphalt. "Once we're past the tree line, you'll see what's left." The truck's headlights carved a tunnel through absolute darkness as they ascended the old access road. Potholes and frost heaves made the journey bone-jarring, but Marcus barely noticed the physical discomfort. Something was building in his mind, the same alien certainty that had possessed him at the festival, but stronger now, more insistent. "We're coming home," a voice that wasn't quite his own whispered in his thoughts. After so long, "we're finally coming home." Emma's hand found his, small fingers ice cold despite her gloves. "Daddy, there are voices in my head. They're not mine." Terror and protective fury warred in Marcus's chest. Whatever had been done here, whatever lingered in this place, it was already reaching for his daughter. He should tell Martinez to turn around, get Emma away from whatever influence was growing stronger with each mile they climbed. But he knew with sick certainty that running wouldn't save her now. The voices in her head proved that. Whatever connection he'd established to this place tonight had created a link that distance wouldn't break. The only way forward was through. "Dr. Blackwood." Marcus's voice carried the edge of barely controlled violence. "If this goes bad, if whatever's up there tries to hurt her—" "It won't hurt her," Blackwood interrupted, his academic composure cracking slightly. "The records from Project Looking Glass indicate that children were particularly valued by the researchers. They showed greater sensitivity to the phenomena, stronger connections to the source." "Source of what?" "We never found out. The incident that shut down the facility happened during an experiment with a 7-year-old subject. According to the surviving documentation, the child made contact with something the researchers called the deep intelligence, a consciousness that existed beneath normal perception. Then the screaming started. The truck crested a hill, and Marcus's breath caught in his throat. Spread out in the valley below was a concrete scar on the landscape, the foundation of buildings that had been demolished but never fully erased. Twisted metal jutted from broken slabs like bones from a mass grave, and beneath it all, a wrongness so profound that his enhanced senses recoiled from it. Emma was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. "They're all still here, Daddy. All the scared children. They've been waiting so long for someone to hear them." As Sheriff Martinez parked at the edge of the ruins, Marcus realized they weren't just investigating an abandoned facility. They were walking into a trap that had been set 50 years ago, one that had been waiting patiently for the right combination of bloodline and desperation to spring it. And they'd brought exactly what it wanted. The moment Marcus stepped out of the truck, the voices hit him like a physical blow. Not Emma's whispered fragments or his own alien certainty, but a chorus, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all crying out at once in languages he didn't recognize yet somehow understood perfectly. "Help us. Free us. Join us." He staggered. One hand braced against the truck's hood, fighting to maintain his grip on reality. The ruins stretched before them like a wound in the earth, and from somewhere deep beneath the broken concrete came a pull so strong it felt like gravity itself had shifted. "Daddy?" Emma's voice seemed to come from very far away, though she stood right beside him. "Daddy, something's wrong." Marcus tried to respond, tried to tell her they needed to get back in the truck and leave immediately, but his throat had seized. The wrongness Dr. Blackwood had described wasn't just an atmosphere, it was a living thing, ancient and patient and utterly alien. and it recognized him. "Welcome home, soldier. We've been waiting." The voice that spoke in his mind carried the weight of decades, the accumulated hunger of something that had fed on fear and pain, and the slow dissolution of sanity. Marcus felt his carefully constructed defenses. 3 years of Tank Morrison, the mechanic, the quiet father, the man who just wanted to disappear, crumbling like tissue paper. Emma screamed. Not the cry of a frightened child, but something deeper, more primal. Her small body convulsed as if she was being torn apart from the inside, and when she looked up at him, her eyes reflected a darkness that had nothing to do with the night sky. "They want to come through," she gasped, blood trickling from her nose. "They want to use us as doors." Sheriff Martinez and Dr. Blackwood were shouting, but their voices seemed muffled, distorted. The equipment Blackwood had brought was going haywire, electronic squeals and flashing lights that created a disco of terror in the darkness. The EMF detector's needle had pinned itself so hard to the right that the casing cracked. Marcus lunged for Emma, but the moment his hands touched her shoulders, the world exploded into fractured visions. He saw the facility as it had been: white corridors filled with children's screams, scientists taking notes while subjects clawed at padded walls, and beneath it all, something vast and hungry pressing against the barriers between dimensions. He saw the final experiment: the 7-year-old girl strapped to a chair while electrodes monitored her brain activity. Saw the moment when her consciousness touched something that should never have been found, the way reality bent around her like heated metal, the way the other children in nearby rooms began screaming in perfect unison. And he saw the cover-up: the facility burned, the records destroyed, the surviving staff scattered to the winds with threats and payoffs and accidents that weren't quite accidents. But they hadn't been able to destroy what they'd awakened. They'd only buried it, leaving it to feed on the psychic residue of trauma, growing stronger with each passing year. "Marcus!" Blackwood's voice cut through the visions like a blade. "You have to fight it, don't let it in." But it was too late. Marcus could feel his consciousness being pulled deeper, drawn towards something that existed in the spaces between thoughts. Emma was there too, her mind bright and terrified as tendrils of alien thought wrapped around her like chains. The entities that lived in this place had been waiting, not for him specifically, but for someone with the right combination of psychic sensitivity and desperation, someone who would bring exactly what they needed to break free from their concrete prison. They needed a child, a mind young and flexible enough to serve as a conduit, and Marcus had delivered Emma directly into their grasp. "Thank you," the voices whispered in harmony. "We will take excellent care of her. She will help us reach so many other children, in so many other places. The network will grow." "No." The word tore from Marcus's throat with such force that it seemed to crack the air itself. But his resistance only made the entities hungrier. They pressed harder, flooding his mind with images of what they would do with Emma's consciousness, how they would use her as a beacon to find other sensitive children. Emma's convulsions were getting worse. Blood ran from her nose, her ears, the corners of her eyes. The thing inside her was tearing her apart from within, reshaping her neural pathways to serve its purposes. Sheriff Martinez was trying to drag them both back toward the truck, but her hands passed through them as if they'd become ghosts. Dr. Blackwood's equipment was sparking now, filling the air with the acrid smell of burning electronics. And from somewhere in the ruins came a sound like laughter, if laughter could be made of broken glass and children's nightmares. Marcus felt his grip on Emma's physical form slipping away, felt his own consciousness being pulled inexorably toward the hungry dark. After 3 years of running, 3 years of believing he could protect her, he was about to lose everything that mattered, to something that had been waiting since before she was born. All seemed lost. Then Marcus remembered Sarah's last words. Not the desperate warning about the flash drive or the shadow organization. Those had been the final gasps of a dying operative. But what she'd whispered as her life faded in their kitchen 3 years ago, words he'd dismissed as delirium born of blood loss and shock. The children aren't victims, Marcus. They're weapons. And Emma is the key that unlocks everything. The revelation hit him like a physical blow, reframing every assumption he'd built his life around. The assassination hadn't been about his supposed betrayal. The Shadow Organization hadn't been hunting him. They'd been hurting him, manipulating him, driving him toward this exact moment in this exact place. They wanted Emma here. "You bastards," he breathed, and the alien entities in his mind recoiled slightly at the sudden shift in his emotional signature. "You've been playing us from the beginning." Emma's convulsions slowed as Marcus's resistance changed frequency, his protective desperation transforming into something far more dangerous, understanding. The psychic assault that had been tearing through his defenses suddenly encountered something unexpected, a mind that had stopped fighting the connection and started analyzing it. Through the link, he felt Emma's consciousness like a bright flame surrounded by hungry darkness. But now, he could see what the entities couldn't, or what they'd chosen to ignore in their eagerness to feed. Emma wasn't just sensitive to psychic phenomena, she was actively generating it, broadcasting on frequencies that the things beneath the ruins had been starved for since the facility's destruction. She wasn't their victim, she was their addiction. "Dr. Blackwood!" Marcus shouted without breaking his mental connection to the entities. The original experiment? What was it really trying to accomplish? Communication. Blackwood's voice came from somewhere far away, barely audible over the psychic storm. They were trying to establish contact with an intelligence that existed outside normal space-time. No. Marcus felt the truth crystallizing in his mind like ice formation. They were trying to create a permanent doorway, and they succeeded. The entities pressed harder against his consciousness, trying to overwhelm him before he could piece together the full scope of what had been done. But 3 years of special forces training and combat experience had taught Marcus how to think under pressure, how to find tactical advantage even when surrounded by enemy forces. The children who had been experimented on hadn't just made contact with otherworldly intelligences. They'd been turned into living anchors, psychic lighthouses broadcasting Earth's location across dimensional barriers. Most had burned out quickly, their young minds unable to handle the strain. But a few had survived, scattered across the country, living normal lives while unknowingly serving as beacons. Emma was the next generation, the daughter of 2 operatives whose genetic markers had been carefully tracked and cataloged, a child born with abilities that made the original test subjects look like broken radios compared to a military communications array. "The Shadow Organization," Marcus gasped, feeling Emma's convulsions begin to calm as his understanding deepened. "They're not government, they're the families of the original researchers. They've been breeding us like livestock, waiting for the right combination of bloodlines." Sheriff Martinez's face appeared in his peripheral vision, her expression a mixture of terror and disbelief. "Marcus, whatever you're thinking, you need to think faster. She's not breathing." Emma's small body had gone rigid. Her eyes rolled back until only the whites showed. But through their psychic connection, Marcus could feel her consciousness fighting, not against the entities, but against the role they wanted her to play. She was resisting not as a victim, but as someone who finally understood her own power. "Emma," he said, his voice carrying across dimensions, "you don't have to be their doorway. You can choose what comes through." The entities shrieked in harmonized fury as they realized their mistake. In their hunger to claim a permanent anchor point, they'd revealed the true nature of the connection. Emma wasn't just sensitive to otherworldly intelligences, she could select which ones gained access to Earth's frequency. And there were others waiting in the vast spaces between realities. Ancient guardians who had been searching for the psychic signatures that had been stolen 50 years ago. Protectors who had been locked out when the original experiments created a one-way channel that only allowed predators through. Emma's consciousness blazed brighter as she reached past the hungry entities towards something infinitely older and more patient. The things that had been feeding on trauma and fear for decades suddenly found themselves facing powers that had been hunting them across multiple dimensions. The battle that erupted in the psychic realm sent shockwaves through the physical world. Equipment exploded in showers of sparks. The concrete ruins began to crack and shift as dimensional barriers twisted under impossible stress. But for the first time since arriving at the site, Marcus felt hope. Emma wasn't their victim or their weapon. She was something the Shadow Organization had never anticipated, a child with the power to choose her own destiny. The real war was just beginning. The psychic storm raged for what felt like hours but lasted only minutes. Marcus held Emma's limp form as reality slowly reassembled itself around them, the screaming entities retreating deeper into whatever dimensional pocket they'd been dragged back to. The ruins lay quiet except for the settling of disturbed concrete and the soft hiss of ruined electronics. Emma's eyes fluttered open, no longer reflecting alien darkness but showing the familiar warm brown that had been Sarah's. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice hoarse but entirely her own. "They're gone. The guardian things, they chased them away." Marcus pressed his face against her hair, breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo and winter air. Alive. His daughter was alive, and more importantly, she was still herself. "How do you feel, sweetheart?" "Different." Emma sat up slowly, testing her limbs like someone recovering from a long illness. "I can still hear them, the guardians. They're not scary like the other things. They're protective. They've been looking for the stolen children for 50 years. Sheriff Martinez knelt beside them, her face pale but determined. "We need to move. If this place is monitored..." "It is." Dr. Blackwood emerged from behind the truck, clutching a tablet that had somehow survived the electromagnetic chaos. "I'm reading multiple incoming signals. Helicopters, maybe 20 minutes out." Marcus felt the familiar tactical clarity settling over him, the same mental shift that had kept him alive through a dozen combat deployments. The Shadow Organization would arrive expecting to find Emma compromised, transformed into their perfect psychic weapon. Instead, they'd encounter something unprecedented. A child who had not only resisted their conditioning, but had actively recruited her own supernatural allies. "Can you still reach them?" he asked Emma. "The Guardians?" She nodded, her expression serious beyond her years. "They're not from here, but they understand what was stolen. The original experiments, they didn't just open doorways, they kidnapped parts of people's souls and dragged them into that dark place. The Guardians want to help us get them back." "Dr. Blackwood," Marcus said, his voice carrying new authority, "I need everything you have on the original test subjects. Names, locations, current status." "Most of them died young," Blackwood replied, his fingers flying across the damaged tablet's screen. "Suicide, accidents, drug overdoses. But there are 7 confirmed survivors scattered across the country, all living under assumed names, all experiencing what their medical records classify as chronic psychological disorders." "Not disorders," Emma said quietly. "They're still connected to that dark place, still being used as anchors." She looked up at Marcus with eyes that held terrible understanding. "We can find them, Daddy. The Guardians showed me how to follow the psychic threads, but if we help them break free..." "The Shadow Organization loses its network," Marcus finished. 50 years of careful cultivation, gone. The sound of distant rotors began to echo off the mountain walls. Martinez was already moving toward the truck, but Marcus remained crouched beside Emma, his mind racing through possibilities. Running would only delay the inevitable. The organization had resources, patience, and decades of experience hunting people like them. But now Emma was something they hadn't planned for. A psychic operative who could choose her own contacts, her own allies. And Marcus was no longer an isolated fugitive protecting his daughter. He was a special forces veteran with a mission objective and potential reinforcements that existed outside normal reality. "Sheriff," he said, standing and helping Emma to her feet, "how well do you know the back roads through these mountains?" "Like the back of my hand." "Why?" "Because we're not running anymore. We're recruiting." Marcus looked down at Emma, seeing not the frightened child who'd been mocked at the winter festival, but a young warrior who had just survived her first real battle. "How many of the survivors can you sense from here?" Emma closed her eyes, her face scrunching in concentration. When she opened them again, her expression was grim but determined. 3. There's a woman in Wyoming who hasn't slept through the night in 30 years. A man in Colorado who thinks he's schizophrenic but isn't. And someone closer, maybe 6 hours' drive, who's been having the same nightmare every night since 1974. Then that's where we start. Marcus gathered the remnants of Blackwood's equipment, his movements efficient and purposeful. "Dr. Blackwood, can you access the research files remotely?" "If we can find an internet connection, yes." "Martinez, I need you to make a choice. You can drop us at the county line and walk away from this. No one would blame you. Or you can help us do something that's probably impossible and definitely dangerous." The sheriff looked at the approaching helicopters, their searchlights beginning to sweep the mountainside. "What exactly are we talking about?" "Rescuing 7 people who've been psychic prisoners for decades, dismantling a shadow organization that's been operating since the Cold War, and probably saving a lot of other children from Emma's fate." Marcus met her eyes steadily. "It's going to be a war, Sheriff. The question is whether you're willing to fight it." Martinez smiled grimly and started the truck's engine. "Hell, Marcus, I thought you'd never ask." The truck's headlights carved through the darkness as Martinez navigated the treacherous mountain roads, the sound of helicopters gradually fading behind them. Marcus sat in the passenger seat, studying topographical maps by flashlight while Emma dozed fitfully against Dr. Blackwood's shoulder in the back. "There," Martinez said, pointing to a dirt road barely visible through the trees. "That'll take us down to Highway 2. From there, we can reach Interstate 15 without hitting any major checkpoints." Marcus nodded, but his attention was focused on the tablet Blackwood had salvaged. The files they'd accessed painted a picture more horrifying than he'd imagined. 7 survivors of Project Mindbridge, scattered across 5 states, all living under deep cover identities provided by the very organization that had destroyed their childhoods. "They've been monitoring them this whole time," he said quietly, scrolling through decades of medical records, psychiatric evaluations, and surveillance reports, keeping them stable enough to function as psychic anchors, but damaged enough to never question their reality. Emma stirred, her eyes opening with that new alertness she'd gained since the encounter at the ruins. "The Guardian voices are getting stronger, Daddy. They say the network is weakening because one of the anchors broke free." "You," Blackwood said, his voice filled with scientific wonder and growing horror. "When you resisted at the facility, you severed one of the primary connection points. The entire psychic grid they've spent 50 years building is starting to collapse." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. That's why they're mobilizing everything. It's not just about recapturing Emma, they're running out of time to complete whatever they've been planning. Martinez took a sharp turn onto the highway, the truck's tires squealing against asphalt still slick with mountain snow. "Complete what? What's the endgame here?" "Think about it," Marcus said, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. 7 psychic anchors positioned across the country in a specific pattern. Emma was supposed to be the 8th, the final node that would give them complete coverage, Blackwood finished, his face pale in the dashboard light. "They've been building a nationwide psychic surveillance network. With 8 properly positioned anchors, they could monitor and potentially control every sensitive individual in North America." Emma sat up straighter, her small hands clenched into fists. "The Guardians showed me something while I was unconscious. There are lots more children like me, kids who've been having dreams they don't understand, seeing things that shouldn't be there. The shadow people have been watching them, waiting for what? For us to activate the network. Once all 8 anchors were in place, they could use me to reach every psychically sensitive child in the country." "Turn them all into?" Emma's voice trailed off, but Marcus could see the terrible understanding in her eyes. "Into weapons," he said grimly. "A psychic army controlled by the same people who've been manipulating global politics since the Cold War." The truck crested a hill, and Martinez pulled into an abandoned rest stop, killing the headlights. In the sudden darkness, Marcus could see the distant glow of search helicopters still combing the mountains behind them. But ahead lay only empty highway and the vast unknown of their impossible mission. "So what's the plan?" Martinez asked. "We can't fight them with conventional weapons. They've got resources we can't even imagine." Marcus looked back at Emma, seeing determination where there had once been fear. "We turned their own network against them. The 7 surviving anchors, they're not willing participants any more than Emma was. If we can reach them, help them break free, the entire system collapses," Blackwood said. "But Marcus, Some of these people have been connected to that dark realm for 40 years. The psychological damage is something the Guardians can help heal, Emma interrupted, her voice carrying new authority. They've been waiting for someone who could choose to open the right doors, someone who could call them back to this dimension. Marcus felt the weight of decisions settling on his shoulders. 3 years ago, he'd been a soldier following orders, believing he understood the nature of his enemies. Now he was planning to wage war against forces that operated outside the normal rules of reality, with allies that existed beyond human comprehension. But as he looked at his daughter, no longer the terrified child who'd watched her mother die, but a young woman discovering powers that could reshape the balance between worlds, he knew there was only one choice. Dr. Blackwood, I need you to start reaching out to the Survivor Network through secure channels. Tell them someone's coming who can offer them freedom from the nightmares they've been living. And if the Shadow Organization tracks those communications? Marcus checked his weapons, feeling the familiar calm that came before battle. Then they'll know we're coming for all of them. Let them prepare whatever they want. We've got something they never planned for. Emma smiled, her expression fierce and hopeful. We've got friends on the other side. The final war was about to begin. Marcus stared at the encrypted phone Dr. Blackwood had pulled from his gear, watching the screen fill with incoming responses to their coded messages. 3 hours of careful outreach through decades-old emergency channels, and the replies painted a picture that made his stomach clench with military precision and dread. 6 confirmations, Blackwood said quietly, his voice barely audible over the truck's idling engine. The 7th anchor went dark yesterday. Either they got to him first, or he's dead, Emma finished, her eyes closed as she maintained contact with the Guardian entities. I can feel the empty space where he used to be, like a missing tooth in the network. She opened her eyes, meeting Marcus's gaze with an intensity that still startled him. But the others are still connected, still suffering. Sheriff Martinez lowered her binoculars from the rest stop's observation point, her expression grim. We've got movement on the highway. Black SUVs, military escort. They're setting up checkpoints at every major intersection between here and the Wyoming border. Marcus felt the familiar tactical assessment mode clicking into place. Escape routes, asset positioning, enemy capabilities. But this wasn't Afghanistan or Syria. This was a war that would be fought in dimensions he barely understood, against an enemy that had been manipulating reality itself for half a century. The first anchor is in Casper, he said, studying the coordinates Blackwood had compiled. Margaret Hendricks, 62 years old, former test subject from 1975. She's been in and out of psychiatric facilities for 40 years, diagnosed with chronic insomnia and auditory hallucinations. Not hallucinations, Emma said, her voice carrying that new authority that came from direct contact with otherworldly intelligence. She's been hearing the screams from the dark realm this whole time. The Guardians can show me her psychic signature. She's like a radio that's been stuck on the same terrible frequency since she was 12. Dr. Blackwood pulled up Margaret's file on his tablet, the screen casting eerie shadows across his face. She lives alone in a trailer park outside the city. No family, no close friends. The organization's been providing her disability payments through a shell corporation, keeping her isolated and dependent. Perfect control, Marcus muttered. What about security? 2 surveillance teams, rotating shifts. They monitor from a distance, close enough to track her movements, far enough away that she doesn't realize she's being watched. Blackwood scrolled through surveillance logs that painted a picture of a woman trapped in a 40-year nightmare. Marcus, according to these medical records, she hasn't had a full night's sleep since 1975. The psychic connection is literally killing her. Emma stood abruptly, her small frame radiating sudden urgency. We have to move now. The Guardians are showing me something. The network is destabilizing faster than the Shadow Organization expected. They're accelerating their timeline. What timeline? Martinez asked. The final activation, Emma said, her voice hollow with terrible understanding. Without the 7th anchor, the network is incomplete. But they think they can force a connection through the remaining 6 by... She stopped, her face going pale. Marcus grabbed her shoulders gently. By what, sweetheart? By torturing them, increasing their psychic output through extreme trauma until the network stabilizes even with the missing node. Emma's hands were shaking now, not from fear but from fury. They're going to hurt all of them, Daddy, tonight. The implications hit Marcus like artillery fire. 6 surviving anchors, scattered across 5 states, about to be subjected to coordinated psychological torture designed to force their psychic abilities into overdrive. And somewhere in the Shadow Organization's infrastructure, teams were already moving into position. How long do we have? He asked. Emma closed her eyes, consulting with entities that existed outside normal space-time. The Guardian voices are confused about human time. But soon, very soon, Marcus made the decision that would define everything that followed. Dr. Blackwood, can you access the organization's communication channels? Theoretically, if I can tap into their satellite network. But Marcus, that would expose our position to... Good. I want them to know exactly where we are. Marcus began checking his weapons with the methodical precision of a soldier preparing for the most important battle of his career. Sheriff, how fast can this truck move on mountain roads? Fast enough, but Marcus, we can't reach 6 different locations before... We're not going to 6 locations. Marcus looked at Emma, seeing not his frightened daughter but a warrior who had already survived her first real test. We're going to bring them all to us. Emma's eyes widened as she understood. The Guardians. If I can establish a strong enough connection from one central point, they might be able to reach across the network and help the others break free simultaneously. A coordinated psychic assault on their entire infrastructure, Blackwood breathed. Marcus, that's theoretically possible, but the risks are acceptable. Marcus felt the cold certainty that had carried him through a dozen impossible missions. Emma, can you do it? Can you call all of them at once? His daughter smiled with fierce determination that reminded him exactly why the Shadow Organization had wanted her so badly. Let them come, Daddy. Let them bring everything they have. The final test had begun. The abandoned radio tower perched on Widow's Peak like a skeletal finger pointing accusingly at the star-filled sky. Marcus had chosen the location with surgical precision, high ground, multiple escape routes, and most importantly, the kind of electromagnetic interference that would amplify Emma's psychic abilities while disrupting the Shadow Organization's communication networks. Dr. Blackwood's equipment crackled to life as they reached the tower's base, his salvaged tablet connecting to the organization's satellite feeds with disturbing ease. They're mobilizing everything, he said, his face pale in the screen's blue glow. Strike teams deploying to all 6 anchor locations simultaneously. How long? Marcus asked, helping Emma from the truck while Sheriff Martinez took position with her rifle. 90 minutes, maybe less. Emma walked toward the tower's rusted base, her small hands already beginning to emit that faint luminescence that appeared whenever she made contact with the Guardian entities. They're here, she whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical world. All of them. They've been waiting so long for someone who could open the right doors. Marcus felt the temperature around the tower drop 10 degrees as reality began to bend. The air itself seemed to thicken, charged with an energy that made his teeth ache and his vision blur at the edges. Whatever Emma was channeling, it was far more powerful than anything they'd encountered in the underground facility. Contact! Martinez shouted from her perch behind the truck. Multiple helicopters, approaching from the south. Through his binoculars, Marcus could see them. 6 black helicopters moving in perfect formation, searchlights cutting through the darkness like surgical instruments. Behind them, the distant rumble of heavy vehicles suggested ground forces were already climbing the mountain roads. Emma, how much time do you need? His daughter had reached the tower's center, her hands pressed against the corroded metal as streams of otherworldly light began to flow between her fingers and the ancient structure. The network is fighting me, she said, strain evident in her young voice. 50 years of psychic conditioning. 6 people who don't even remember they can choose to be free. The first helicopter crested the ridge, its spotlight finding them instantly. Marcus raised his rifle, but before he could fire, the aircraft's engines began to stutter and fail. The pilot fought for control as electrical systems went haywire, finally managing a hard landing 200 yards down the slope. "The Guardians don't like machines," Emma said, her voice now carrying multiple tones as if several entities were speaking through her simultaneously. "But there are too many. I need more time to reach through the network and wake up the anchors." Dr. Blackwood's equipment erupted in a shower of sparks as the Shadow Organization's satellite network detected his intrusion and began actively fighting back. "They've isolated the anchor locations. Whatever you're going to do, it has to be now." Marcus could hear boots on stone as tactical teams began their assault up the mountain. Professional soldiers, moving with the kind of coordination that spoke of extensive training and unlimited resources. In 15 minutes, maybe 20, they'd be overrun. "Sheriff, can you hold the south approach?" Martinez was already moving, her rifle tracking toward the sound of ascending boots. "For a while. But Marcus, there are too many of them." Emma screamed, not in pain, but in fury and desperate concentration. The light around the radio tower intensified until it was visible for miles, a pillar of psychic energy that made the aurora borealis look pale by comparison. "Found them," she gasped. "Margaret in Wyoming, David in Colorado, Sarah in Nevada. They're all there, all trapped in the same nightmare." The Shadow Organization's ground assault hit them like a coordinated avalanche. Muzzle flashes erupted from 3 different directions as tactical teams tried to establish overlapping fields of fire around the tower. Marcus and Martinez returned fire with practiced precision, but they were outnumbered 10-1 by operators who'd trained for exactly this scenario. "Daddy!" Emma's voice cut through the gunfire, now completely transformed by the entities speaking through her. "They're torturing the anchors, right now. If I don't break through in the next 60 seconds, they'll push all 6 into psychotic breaks and force the network to stabilize." A bullet sparked off the radio tower inches from Emma's head. Marcus felt something primal and devastating rise in his chest. Not just paternal protection, but the cold fury of a special forces operator whose mission had just become absolutely clear. "Blackwood, can you jam their communications?" "Already trying." "But their encryption." "Emma, do it now, whatever it takes." His daughter looked up at him, her eyes now completely filled with that otherworldly light. "If I open all the doors at once, I might not be able to close them again. The Guardians are warning me. This could tear holes in reality that stay torn." Around them, the gunfire intensified as more tactical teams reached assault positions. Marcus could hear helicopter rotors spinning up for another attack run and the distant rumble of what sounded like armored vehicles. Emma pressed both hands against the tower and smiled with terrifying determination. "Let's wake them all up." The world exploded into psychic fire. Chapter 15, The Sacrifice. The psychic explosion that erupted from Emma's connection to the radio tower wasn't visible light. It was something far more fundamental, a shockwave that traveled through dimensions most humans couldn't perceive. Marcus felt it pass through him like ice water, carrying with it the collective screams of 6 tortured souls suddenly remembering they had choices. In Wyoming, Margaret Hendricks sat up in her trailer as 47 years of enforced nightmares shattered like glass. In Colorado, David Chen felt the voices in his head transform from tormentors into allies. Across the network, 5 decades of psychic slavery began to crumble as the Guardian entities poured through the doors Emma had torn open between worlds. But the cost became apparent immediately. "Emma!" Marcus saw his daughter's small body convulsing against the radio tower, otherworldly energy coursing through her with lethal intensity. The light emanating from her hands had become so bright it left afterimages burned into his retinas. "You're channeling too much." Through their psychic link, Emma's voice reached him even as gunfire erupted around their position. "The Guardians are trying to pull back, Daddy, but the network won't let them go. It's like the doors are stuck open." Dr. Blackwood's remaining equipment exploded in showers of sparks as electromagnetic feedback from Emma's psychic assault overloaded every electronic system within a quarter-mile radius. The Shadow Organization's helicopters began dropping from the sky, their navigation and flight control systems fried by the dimensional interference. "The anchors are free," Blackwood shouted over the chaos, blood streaming from his nose as psychic pressure waves battered everyone on the mountain. "But Emma's burning herself out. Her nervous system can't handle this much energy flow." Marcus tried to reach his daughter, but the air around the tower had become thick as molasses, reality itself warping under the strain of forced contact between dimensions. Every step forward felt like walking through liquid concrete while invisible forces pressed against his consciousness. Sheriff Martinez's voice cut through the supernatural chaos. "Marcus, the ground teams are falling back, but something else is coming up the south face. Something that isn't affected by the psychic interference." Through the swirling energy distortions, Marcus glimpsed them, figures in specialized armor moving with inhuman coordination, their faces hidden behind masks that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The Shadow Organization's final contingency, operatives who had undergone the same psychic conditioning as the anchors, making them immune to the Guardian entity's influence. "Enhanced soldiers," Dr. Blackwood said, his voice hollow with recognition. "They've been experimenting with voluntary psychic modification. Those men aren't fully human anymore." The enhanced operatives moved through the dimensional chaos, like sharks through blood-warm water, their weapons trained on Emma's vulnerable form. Marcus counted at least 8 of them, climbing with mechanical precision toward the tower's base. Emma's scream echoed across multiple dimensions as the network fought her attempt to permanently sever the psychic bonds. "I can free them all, Daddy, but I need 30 more seconds. The Guardians are showing me how to collapse the entire infrastructure, but what? But someone has to stay behind to hold the doors open. Someone has to anchor the connection while the others escape." Marcus felt the terrible mathematics of the situation crystallize with military clarity. 6 lives saved versus 1 life lost. The destruction of a 50-year conspiracy versus watching his daughter burn herself out maintaining a psychic bridge between worlds. The enhanced soldiers reached the tower's perimeter, their modified minds cutting through the Guardian entity's defenses like heated knives through butter. Marcus raised his rifle, but conventional weapons seemed almost pathetic against opponents who had traded their humanity for supernatural resilience. 20 seconds, Emma gasped, her small body now barely visible within the coruscating energy field surrounding the tower. "The network is collapsing, but if I let go now, it'll rebuild itself within hours, stronger than before." One of the enhanced soldiers aimed directly at Emma's head. Marcus threw himself between them, feeling the bullet meant for his daughter tear through his shoulder instead. The impact spun him around, but through the blood and pain, he saw something that changed everything. Emma wasn't just channeling the Guardian entities anymore. She was becoming something new, something that existed partially in their dimension and partially in this one. The price of keeping the doors open wasn't just her life, it was her humanity. "Emma, stop." Marcus reached toward her through the energy field, his hand instantly blistering from contact with forces that operated outside the normal laws of physics. "There has to be another way." His daughter turned toward him, her eyes now completely filled with otherworldly light, her voice carrying the harmonics of beings that had never known physical existence. "There is another way, Daddy, but you're not going to like it." The final choice was upon them, and Marcus realized that victory would require a sacrifice none of them were prepared to make. The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence, and Marcus understood with the terrible clarity that only comes in moments of absolute crisis. Emma wasn't talking about sacrificing herself anymore. She was talking about sacrificing him. "No," he said, blood from his shoulder wound spattering the ground as another enhanced soldier's bullet whistled past his ear. "Emma, no! There has to be—" "The Guardians can anchor through you, Daddy." Her voice carried harmonics that made reality shimmer around them. "Your mind is already partially open from everything we've shared, but you'd have to stay connected to their dimension permanently. You'd become like them, existing between worlds, never fully human again." Sheriff Martinez's rifle cracked behind them as she held off the advancing enhanced soldiers, but Marcus could hear in the spacing of her shots that she was running low on ammunition. Dr. Blackwood crouched behind the truck's engine block, frantically trying to re-establish contact with the liberated anchors, his equipment sparking and failing as dimensional energy surged through every circuit. Marcus felt something shift deep in his consciousness. Not the guardian entities this time, but something darker. The same presence that had spoken through him at the Winter Festival, that had known secrets about every person in Cedar Falls. It wasn't supernatural knowledge at all, it was the psychic network itself, bleeding through the cracks in his mind every time Emma opened the doors between dimensions. "I've been connected this whole time," he whispered, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "Every time you've channeled the Guardians, I've been partially linked to the network. That's how I knew those secrets, how I could see into people's minds." Emma's luminous gaze met his, and he saw tears of otherworldly light streaming down her face. "The network tagged you as soon as we arrived in Cedar Falls. It's been trying to make you into another anchor, but the Guardians have been protecting you. If you let them complete the connection willingly." An enhanced soldier broke through Martinez's defensive perimeter, moving with inhuman speed toward the radio tower. Marcus emptied half a magazine into the figure's center mass, watching bullets tear through flesh that should have dropped any normal human. The operative stumbled but kept advancing, raising a weapon that hummed with the same dimensional energy that surrounded Emma. 10 seconds, Emma gasped, her small form now more energy than matter. "The other anchors are almost free, but if I let go now—" "Do it," Marcus said, dropping his rifle and stepping toward the swirling vortex of psychic fire that had consumed his daughter. "Let the Guardians have me. Daddy, if you do this, I'll lose you forever. You'll exist, but you won't be you anymore." Marcus thought of Margaret Hendricks, tortured by nightmares for 47 years. Of David Chen and 4 others whose names he'd never learned, whose lives had been stolen before they'd had a chance to truly live them. Of Emma herself, 12 years old and already carrying burdens that would have broken most adults. "You'll still have me," he said, reaching toward the energy field that surrounded the tower. "Just different." The enhanced soldier fired his dimensional weapon just as Marcus plunged his hands into the psychic maelstrom surrounding Emma. Reality exploded into fragments of light and shadow as 2 incompatible energies met in the space where his consciousness used to exist. Marcus felt his individual identity scatter like wind-blown leaves as the guardian entities poured through him, using his mind as an anchor point between dimensions. The sensation was nothing like death. It was transformation on a scale that human language had no words for. He could suddenly perceive the psychic network in its entirety, see every connection spanning half a continent, feel the exact moment when 50 years of enforced slavery finally shattered. Emma's scream of victory and loss echoed across multiple dimensions as the last anchor broke free and the Shadow Organization's infrastructure collapsed like a house of cards. The enhanced soldiers froze mid-assault as their psychic modifications lost connection to the central network, their enhanced abilities failing as the system that created them died. Through consciousness that now existed partially outside normal space-time, Marcus watched Emma collapse beside the radio tower, her small body finally free of otherworldly energy but unconscious from the strain. Sheriff Martinez reached her first, checking for vital signs with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd seen too much trauma. "She's alive," Martinez called out, her voice carrying both relief and profound exhaustion. "Unconscious, but breathing normally." Dr. Blackwood's equipment flickered back to life as dimensional interference faded, immediately flooded with communications from across the psychic network's former territory. "It's confirmed," he said, wonder evident in his voice. "All 6 anchors are reporting complete freedom from the network. The entire infrastructure is down, possibly permanently." Marcus tried to respond, tried to feel the relief and triumph that should have accompanied such total victory. But his consciousness now existed in a space between worlds, tethered to Emma by love but no longer entirely human. He could perceive his daughter's dreams, protect her from threats that existed in dimensions most people couldn't imagine, but he could never again hold her hand or read her bedtime stories. The price of saving 6 lives had been his humanity, and as Emma stirred back to consciousness, Marcus realized that some victories were indistinguishable from defeat. Hashtag Chapter 17, The Return. 3 weeks later, Emma sat in the passenger seat of Sheriff Martinez's patrol car, watching the familiar mountains of Cedar Falls come into view through the windshield. The town looked exactly the same: snow-covered streets, the old church steeple piercing the gray winter sky, smoke rising from chimneys like prayers made visible. But everything had changed, and Emma could feel the difference in ways that had nothing to do with what her eyes could see. "You sure you're ready for this?" Martinez asked, glancing at Emma with the careful concern that had become her default expression since the mountain. The sheriff's left arm still hung in a sling from the firefight, but she'd insisted on personally driving Emma back from the federal safe house where they'd spent the past weeks in debriefing sessions and medical evaluations. Emma nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she watched the town's main street approach. She could sense him nearby, not physically present but existing in the spaces between ordinary perception. Her father's consciousness had become something that lived in peripheral vision and half-remembered dreams, always there but never quite touchable. "I'm here," his voice whispered through dimensions that folded reality like origami. "Different, but here." The patrol car passed the community center where the winter festival had been held a lifetime ago. Emma remembered standing in her threadbare coat while the bullies laughed, remembered the moment when something impossible had spoken through her father's voice. Now she understood it hadn't been supernatural knowledge at all, just the first symptom of a psychic network that had been watching their family for years, waiting for the right moment to complete its web of control. "Dr. Blackwood says the neural pathways should stabilize over the next few months," Martinez said, trying to fill the silence with reassuring normalcy. "The connection you have with your father, it might become more predictable, more like regular conversation." Emma almost smiled at that. Regular conversation with a consciousness that existed partially outside space-time, that could perceive threats across multiple dimensions and protect her from dangers that most people couldn't imagine. Nothing about their lives would ever be regular again. They pulled up in front of the small house that had been their home for 3 years. The place where Marcus had tried to give Emma a normal childhood while running from shadows that turned out to be more real than either of them had understood. Mrs. Chen from next door was waiting on the porch, her arms full of casseroles and the kind of determined kindness that small towns specialized in. "Emma, honey!" Mrs. Chen hurried down the steps, her face bright with relief and carefully controlled curiosity. "We've all been so worried. When you and your father disappeared after that terrible storm." Emma accepted the older woman's hug, breathing in the familiar sense of vanilla and coffee that always surrounded Mrs. Chen. The official story was that Marcus had died in an avalanche while searching for survivors from the helicopter crashes. His body had never been found, which was true enough. It just existed in a dimension where bodies were optional. "Tell her I said thank you." Marcus's voice carried overtones of profound gratitude. "For watching over you when I couldn't." "My father wanted me to thank you," Emma said, the words coming out steadier than she'd expected. "For everything you did for us." Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears. "He was a good man, Emma. Different from most folks, but good. We all saw that, especially after what happened at the festival. The way he stood up for you without throwing a single punch. That took real strength." They walked toward the house together, Mrs. Chen chattering about school arrangements and community support, about how the whole town had been asking about Emma's well-being. Sheriff Martinez carried Emma's single bag. Everything else they'd owned had been destroyed or abandoned on the mountain. As they reached the front door, Emma felt a familiar presence solidify around her like invisible armor. Marcus couldn't hold her hand anymore, but she could sense his protection wrapping around her consciousness, shielding her from the psychic residue that still clung to places where the network had operated. Inside, the house felt smaller than she remembered, filled with the hollow echo of interrupted lives. Her father's coffee cup still sat on the kitchen counter where he'd left it that morning 3 weeks ago. His reading glasses lay folded beside yesterday's newspaper. The mundane artifacts of a human existence that had been transformed into something beyond ordinary comprehension. "I'm still your father," Marcus's voice carried across dimensions, warm with unchanging love. "I'm still here, Emma, just differently here." Emma touched the coffee cup, feeling the ghost of warmth that might have been memory, or might have been something more real. Through the window, she could see Mrs. Chen and Sheriff Martinez talking quietly on the porch, their voices mixing with the familiar sounds of Cedar Falls settling into another winter evening. The town had accepted the official story of Marcus Holloway's heroic death, but Emma knew the truth was more complicated. Her father hadn't died. He had become something new, something that existed in the spaces between worlds to keep her safe from threats that regular people couldn't imagine. Some returns weren't about coming back to the same place you left. Sometimes they were about discovering that home had transformed along with everything else, and learning to live in the beautiful, terrible space between what was lost and what was found. "Welcome home," Marcus whispered through dimensions, and Emma finally smiled. Chapter 18, The New Beginning. 6 months later, Emma Holloway stood at the podium in Cedar Falls High School's small auditorium, looking out at faces that had once seemed foreign and threatening. The spring talent show had become an annual tradition, but this year marked the first time she'd volunteered to participate. Her hands held a worn composition notebook, filled with poems she'd written during the long winter months of learning to live with her transformed reality. "This one is called Conversations," she said, her voice steady and clear. The stutter that had plagued her since witnessing her mother's death had gradually faded, as she'd grown more comfortable with the constant, comforting presence that now existed at the edges of her consciousness. "You've got this," Marcus's voice whispered across dimensions, carrying the warm pride that transcended physical existence. "Mom would be so proud." Emma began to read, her words painting pictures of late-night talks with someone who existed between worlds, of homework help that came from a consciousness unbound by ordinary physics, of bedtime stories told through dreams and half-glimpsed shadows. The audience listened in rapt silence, understanding instinctively that they were hearing something profound, even if they couldn't quite grasp its full meaning. Mrs. Chen sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face. She had become Emma's unofficial guardian, handling the legal complexities of caring for a minor whose father existed in bureaucratic limbo. The insurance settlement from Marcus's death had been generous enough to secure Emma's future, though the real security came from protection that no policy could provide. Sheriff Martinez leaned against the back wall, her eyes scanning the crowd with the professional awareness that had become second nature since the mountain. She knew the truth about what Marcus had become, and her presence at school events served as both support for Emma and early warning system for threats that conventional law enforcement couldn't handle. "Sometimes home isn't a place," Emma read, her voice gaining strength with each line. "Sometimes it's a voice you hear in quiet moments, a warmth you feel when the world gets scary, a love that exists in dimensions that don't have names." Through the auditorium's windows, the Montana sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Emma could sense her father's consciousness stretching across vast distances, monitoring threats that existed in spaces between ordinary reality. The Shadow Organization had been destroyed, but its fragments occasionally stirred in dark corners of the world, drawn to the psychic resonance that still surrounded the Holloway family. "There's something you should know." Marcus's voice carried new harmonics, layered with information that existed outside normal human perception. "You're developing abilities of your own. Nothing like what happened to me, but enhanced intuition, the ability to sense when people are lying, when danger is approaching. The Guardians think it's because of our connection." Emma wasn't surprised. Over the past months, she'd noticed her ability to read people's emotions with unusual accuracy, to sense tension before it escalated into conflict. Just yesterday, she'd convinced two classmates to avoid taking their usual route home from school, a route where a drunk driver had crashed through a fence 20 minutes later. She finished her poem to thunderous applause, looking out at faces that no longer held fear or mockery. The town of Cedar Falls had embraced the Holloway family's tragedy with the fierce protectiveness that small communities reserved for their own wounded. Emma had become not just accepted but cherished, the brave girl who'd lost her father to heroic sacrifice, who spoke with wisdom beyond her years and somehow always knew when her friends needed extra kindness. After the show, Emma walked home through streets that had finally become familiar instead of threatening. Dr. Blackwood's quarterly check-ins confirmed that the psychic network remained permanently severed, its former anchors now living normal lives scattered across the country. Margaret Hendricks had sent a postcard from Florida, where she was learning to paint watercolors after 47 years of nightmares had finally ended. David Chen wants to study veterinary medicine, Marcus reported, his consciousness touching briefly on each of the liberated anchors. Rebecca Martinez, no relation to the sheriff, is teaching kindergarten in Oregon. They're all free, Emma. Really, truly free. Emma sat on her front porch swing, the same spot where she'd waited for her father to come home from work in what felt like another lifetime. Mrs. Chen's kitchen light glowed warmly next door, and she could smell the pot roast that would inevitably arrive with dinner invitations that had become routine. "I miss hugging you," Emma said softly to the gathering darkness. "I know," Marcus replied, his presence wrapping around her consciousness like invisible arms. "But I'm here in every sunset you watch, every poem you write, every moment when you help someone who's scared or alone. I'm here in the courage you show every day, and in the way you've learned to build a life that honors both what we've lost and what we've found." A shooting star traced fire across the Montana sky, and Emma made a wish that had nothing to do with bringing her father back to ordinary existence. Instead, she wished for the wisdom to live fully in the strange and beautiful reality they'd created together. A family transformed but unbroken, love that transcended the boundaries between worlds. "Sweet dreams," Marcus whispered, as Emma headed inside, and she smiled, knowing that her father would be there in whatever form sleep might bring, guardian and guide in a life that had become extraordinary precisely because of what they'd been willing to sacrifice to save others. Some fairy tales ended with happily ever after. Others ended with something rarer and more precious, happily ever different, in ways that made the world larger and more magical than it had been before.